Okay, thanks. So yeah, Tara is here to help monitor questions in the chat and keep people on mute just to cut down on any background noises. And so I appreciate those of you who completed our pre-training survey. After this class, I'll be sending the post-training survey. And if you could take a couple of minutes just to fill that out, it would help us improve these trainings in the future. Also, this has been approved for 2 CECs if you attend the majority of the class and participate in the poll questions. So we do keep track of all that, how long you were here, who answered the questions. You don't have to get them correct, but you do have to participate for me to be able to send you the certificate. So we'll go over that again at the end, but I just wanted to make that clear because sometimes people send me requests when they haven't done that. So with that out of the way, this is a 2-part class, and we usually have this set up separately so that we do the LOMA one day and then the LOMR-F the next day. This time we've pushed them together for a 2-hour course, and so the first part is going to cover the LOMA, and then the second part, the LOMR-F. And so there is quite a bit of overlap. I'm going to try not to repeat myself too much because they are somewhat similar in ways. But yeah, so I think the first part might go on a little bit longer than exactly halfway, but once I finish the first part of the class, we'll take a short break. We'll do the poll question, and then I will move on to the second part. So again, starting with the LOMA, we have a couple of forms here that we can use. So there's 2 applications depending on what kind of LOMA you're filing for. So there is the MTEZ, which is a Word document, and you can find that at FEMA.gov if you just search for FEMA MTEZ or the MT1. It should take you to a web page where you can find these. They are there with the instructions, and if you're not familiar with doing it or even reviewing anything that comes your way, I would suggest going through the instructions. It can help answer a lot of questions. And then just reading through the applications themselves will give you a lot of information. So the MTEZ is for residential structures or properties, and you're only doing 1 lot or 1 structure at a time. It's, again, not commercial. It's going to be residential, and it's not in the floodway. And so the MTEZ is a little bit shorter and easier to use, but it's only for those types of LOMAs. The MT1 is what you would use for multiple lots or commercial properties, or if it's in the floodway. And so some surveyors just go ahead and use the MT1 application for all their LOMAs so that they don't make a mistake, because you don't want to waste time on something that gets rejected. LOMAs don't have fees associated with them, but anything that causes a delay could be problematic. So some of them just go ahead and use the MT1 for everything, which is fine. That works. It's very similar process using either one for a LOMA. Okay, and then you can see the MT1 here has the other types of letters that you can apply for, which is the CLOMA, or a conditional letter of map amendment, meaning if the structure is built as proposed, it will be out of the floodplain. And then the LOMR-F and the CLOMR-F that we'll again cover in the second part are also on the MT1 application. So that's what the MT1 would be used for. And the MTEZ is only for those certain LOMAs. Okay. And you'll notice both of them have expired back in 2014. So we're in that grace period in between whenever they are going to release the new versions of these applications. So it's been almost 10 years now. So it's kind of in the same boat as the elevation certificate until such time that new documents are released. This is what we're using. And so they do put that on the website, this note that they have expired and they can be used until further notice. So if you have these applications saved on your computer, you might want to go back and periodically check for when they're released. I'm sure once any of those new documents are released, I'll probably be sending out an announcement to everyone that I have on my emailing list so that everyone is notified of that, but it's just good to check in case I missed it. Okay, so the MTEZ, so the first part is pretty self-explanatory. Has fill been placed on the property? If there's any fill, then you would go to the MT1 and that would be the LOMR-F application. If that's applicable, could be a LOMR or something else, but the point being that if there's any fill, then it shouldn't be the MTEZ. So LOMAs are for natural grade. So no fill, they are mapped into the floodplain because of the scale of mapping. They shouldn't have been included in the first place, and so LOMAs are really a correction to the flood map. So again, if there has been any fill, that would be the LOMR-F. And it kind of depends on when the fill was placed, but if it was there before it was mapped into the floodplain, it can be considered natural grade, and I will go into that a little bit more on the LOMR-F section in the second hour. And so just, having this warning, first of all, to make sure that people don't, go forward with the application if it's not the right one. And then the legal description of the property, which can be found on the deed. It says right there that you can use the abbreviated description. Rural areas can have long descriptions. Some new addresses and new developments might not have an official address yet, so that might be an issue that causes some delay, but that needs to be there. And then, are you requesting that a flood zone determination be completed for what? A structure or a portion of the legally recorded property or the entire legal recorded property? So the last one would be pretty rare for it to have the entire property outside of the floodplain on natural grade, but it could happen. Otherwise, more commonly, it's just a portion of the property that can be taken out, which may be preferable because if they do any other work on that piece of property, then it won't be in the floodplain. It wouldn't have to comply and get permits and all of that. Whereas if you just take the structure out, any modification to that structure footprint would invalidate the LOMA, and they would have to, refile, or it would be in the floodplain, whatever the case may be with that. So it might be worth the while to just take out a section of property if it's, if it qualifies as being at or above the BFE. So that's a meets and bounds description. So again, that might save paperwork later on just to have that entire area out. And then the legally recorded property would be based on the lowest lot elevation for that piece of property, which would have to be at or above the BFE, which again, why it's kind of rare for the entire property to be out. So the next section, pretty self-explanatory. It's just contact information. Definitely allow contact by email. It's going to save a lot of time than doing postal mail. I have worked with some surveyors that insist on doing things by postal mail. I'm not really sure why, but FEMA has really started encouraging people to do electronic submission. It's cheaper, saves on postage and paper and all of that. It's a lot faster, so definitely use the online system. Just as a heads up, we have seen some technical issues with it lately, not accepting submissions for some reason. So there may be some technical issues that would be FEMA tech support stuff. So just a FYI that might be going on right now. But the next section, again, we're talking about a legally recorded parcel or a structure. So this is a pretty straightforward application. Again, determination for one structure. So the lowest adjacent grade touching the foundation would have to be at or above the base flood elevation. And then basically it won't be inundated by the base flood. And so the parcel or the portion, some people do try to take out the entire property and have issues. So we have seen that. or other issues that I'll get into more in a little bit. But other than that, you have the property information again, the street address, and then the type of construction. So this is another thing to be aware of, that FEMA reviewers are looking for violations. Violations mostly of the FEMA minimum standards that we have based on the CFR. Not as much higher standards, although things are supposed to comply with any adopted higher standards. But say if you have a basement and they're going to be looking into that and when it was built. And so if there's any violation with that, no matter how long ago it took place, they will flag that and then send it on to us for us to work with you on getting some kind of enforcement action or evaluating if a violation took place. And so just be aware of that. Sometimes FEMA will flag potential violations and then we have to do some kind of enforcement and get it resolved. And so it's a little bit different if we have FEMA kind of pushing that and kind of forcing the enforcement actions to go through, because some other cases might stagnate, but if we have FEMA and us on it, it's a little bit more pertinent. So just something to be aware of. We've been dealing with several cases that have been forwarded onto us as they evaluate these applications. So other than that, we have the geographic coordinate data. They ask for it to be taken out to at least 5 places, and that's a common mistake that we see where it's not taken out at least 5 places. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. As I said, the datum gets left off sometimes, so we want to make sure that that is checked off. And then the map information. So a lot of this is kind of similar to an elevation certificate if you have experience with that. So the NFIP community number is a 6-digit number that's unique to every community. In Kansas, they all start with 200. And then the full map and panel number. So this can be found on the firm. So looking at the Map Service Center or the National Flood Hazard Layer, if you have a digital map, or the State Floodplain Viewer, any of those work, just making sure that you have the full number. And then the base flood elevation, which has to be calculated no matter what zone it's in. And then the source of the base flood elevation, which should be the flood insurance study and a detailed study area, or however that's been calculated in a zone A. There are a couple of options for that I'll go through. Below that, it is asking for the elevation information. What is the lowest adjacent grade or the lowest grade on the property if you're doing the meets and bounds description? Datum, again, that has to be checked. We've seen in some of these potential violations that I mentioned in those case files, there are conversion issues sometimes, or they have forgotten to convert the datum if they're working with 2 different ones. And so that needs to be looked out for. And then, has FEMA identified areas of subsidence or uplift? If it's any work in Cherokee or Reno counties, you may want to check on that. There are some areas of subsidence due to mining in the past. And so that are the only areas I think in Kansas that might have subsidence. There isn't any uplift. And then under that, it is certified and signed and sealed. Okay. And so here is just an example of the title block for the firm. The community number is there, so it has the community listed. The full 6-digit number is there, and then underneath that is the map number. So towards the top where it says panel 193 of 450, that is an abbreviation, so it's not panel 193. The full map number, map and panel number, is the 20177C. C is for countywide 0193E. And so that is the full map and panel number that should be there. Again, it's similar to the elevation certificate, although that is split up onto 2 different boxes on the EC. But that's what they're looking for. if they might ask for additional information. Again, why it's important to give them the email address, making sure that they can get a hold of you quickly. Yep. Okay. You can also find this information on the community status book as far as the community number. So that's another resource for that. The base flood elevation, again, we'll go through how this should be calculated as far as paper maps. And so some of our communities have older paper maps still as we're going through the mapping process for all the different areas of Kansas, but some of the, especially western side, have paper maps still that are a bit older. And so that's why I go through this example. A lot of our eastern communities have the digital maps, and so there is more precise digital ways of doing this. And so if you're not a surveyor, if you're a floodplain administrator and you're reviewing base flood elevations, whether it's for a permit and the elevation certificate or something related to letters of map change, we should just be familiar with this process so that we can ensure that anything you're signing off on is correct. Especially for a LOMR-F with a community acknowledgement form, we want to go through and make sure that the information that we've been given from the applicant and or the developers working together is accurate. And so we can't just trust that they have calculated the base flood elevation correctly. There have definitely been a lot of mistakes before, so it's just something to be aware of, that we shouldn't just take their word for it. Sorry, and so that's why I'm going through this example as far as paper maps. So this is the paper map for Butler County. And so you can see this one is from the Map Service Center. If you have paper maps, you should have the hard copies of those sent from FEMA, at the map repository, wherever that is for the community. So I think if you're doing this, it may be easier to just use that map panel, the full map panel, but you can also do this with a fermet. So I'll go through getting maps from the Map Service Center, but in any case, you can see where the floodplain is on the paper map. You have your floodway and all of the mapped and lettered cross sections here. And then what we've done is gone to Google Maps basically and just put the site location. And so this is for a hypothetical new house that's going in. Well, this is actually a real case, but anyways, that is our site there on the Google map. It's in between these meanders, and you can see that reflected on the paper map as well. It's between cross-section letters L and M. And so M is the upstream cross-section, so that's our cross-section of interest. We're always looking at the upstream number, which is going to be higher. And so that's what we use to calculate the base flood elevation. And so you can see those on the firm. They are rounded base flood elevations, and so that can be problematic. We have had people just use these rounded numbers on the map, which is not how it should be done. It needs to actually be calculated for a particular site. The cross sections themselves have a precise base flood elevation that could be used if that cross section actually passes through the site. Okay, so that's enough to start with here. And so I've put the location on the paper map as well. And so the point of doing the Google map is that you can be a little bit more precise using these more advanced resources in the paper map, such as the aerial imagery that you can see on Google. And then you can measure the exact site location using streets or other landmarks and the distance from those different intersections to get the precise location. And then go back to your paper map and do the same measurements. You're going to be using the paper map scale to do that. But basically, we're trying to isolate the location as precisely as possible. So we have all of our map zones here. This one is in the floodway. It's in the diagonal crosshatching there. And so this is an example of how this can be done. This is a fermet And my previous supervisor had taken this photograph just showing how it can be done with a paper ferment. And so we marked off the development site with a Sharpie. So there's the X there between the meanders and between cross sections L and M, as I mentioned. And then he's taken a string and laid it across the stream channel. And so the proper way of measuring this is to measure along the stream channel, whereas some people just measure it straight. We have seen that, but the official way of doing it is to measure along the stream channel or the Thalweg. And so, as I said, we do have recordings of us doing this digitally, me and some other people from our office. So if you want to see examples of that, let me know. Again, we're just putting this one out there because there are still paper maps. So what he's done is colored the string pink so that you can see it. It's along the stream channel, and then he's also marked off where that intersects with cross section M. Again, that's our upstream cross section, so that's what we're interested in. And so what we're looking at is the distance between the stream channel where it intersects with cross section M and the distance to our development site where this new house is going in. So what we want to measure is the distance from the upstream cross section to the upstream corner of that structure or that structure footprint. So that's where you would measure it. Again, you're going to use the map scale. If you're printing a ferment, then make sure that you are printing the actual size that you've saved it in so that you preserve that scale and you don't get that distortion. And so when he's measured this, and he's using an engineering scale, which are very easy to use, and they're helpful for calculating base flood elevations if you're doing paper. So he's measuring that distance from the upstream corner to the upstream cross section, and then taking that measurement and going to look at the flood insurance study. And so that's the proper way of doing it for an area with a detailed study. That's the way it's supposed to be calculated. So if you have a detailed study area for the source of the BFE, you should be seeing FIS for a flood insurance study, because that's what's been used. So the flood insurance study is basically a detailed report that accompanies the maps, and it has all of the technical data in there that was used to create the maps. So if you do have that for your community, I would definitely recommend getting familiar with that and using that and be able to review it for technical reviews of different applications. And so basically, our site is about a third of the way down. So it's like a third of the distance between L and M. And so we're going to take that and go to the flood profile. So at the end of the FIS, there are stream profiles where we've basically graphed out the map and the different flood frequencies for that stream and how they relate to the lettered and mapped cross section. So that's what we're looking at here. It's kind of a graphical representation of that. And so there is a little bit of judgment here. Using these paper maps, they're not as precise as the newer digital maps. And so again, we are, as floodplain administrators, checking the work of the licensed professional that has put their sign-in seal on it. And so we're just doing the best we can. We should still be coming up with a number that's very close to what they got. So as I said, we're talking about a third of the way down from cross section M. And so the stream direction is from right to left. So the right side is upstream, left side is downstream, just to make that clear. So that's why L is on the left side. And so we're measuring a third of the distance between L and M. And so we're on this graph, and cross section M is not exactly on the line. So again, a little bit of a judgment here. We're being as precise as we can to measure about 2 of those lines down from cross section M, so like 2 boxes. since there are about 6 between L and M. So that is our location of our upstream corner for our building footprint. And so that's where we're going to mark it off. So now that we have this point, all we need to do is drag that line all the way up through the flood frequencies, find where it intersects with the base flood, which is the 100-year flood frequency. And where that intersection is, you would draw the line straight across to the left to the y-axis that gives you the elevation in feet, and then that is the base flood elevation. So we have 1278.2 is what we've measured here, based on measuring from the firm and all of that. So 1278.2 is what we should approximately be getting from the surveyor. And as the floodplain administrator, you have the authority to round up a little bit, require them to build to at least that height, or to the at least 1 foot above that height, because we have the statewide 1 foot above requirement. Some communities have higher than that, but requiring them to at least use that as a base flood elevation, that is allowable. We encourage that, just to make sure that the base flood elevation is at least high enough, and it might keep water out of their first floor during a flood. So that is fine. Just as long as you can back up your work by having measured this yourself, and just stand by that is fine. And so another part of the flood insurance study is you have these floodway data tables. So you have all this information for the mapped and lettered cross sections that are very useful. And so L and M on Dry Creek, again, that's where our site is in between. And so the regulatory flood elevation here is provided. So you have 1277.4 and 1279.0. So of course your base flood elevation that you calculated needs to be within that range. If it's outside that range, you may have made a mistake. We have occasionally found mistakes in the flood insurance study, but it's not very common. So you might want to go through and just make sure that the flood insurance study is accurate, but it's gone through a lot of revision before they're published, so it's most likely correct. So yeah, if you've gone outside that range, something may be wrong. Go back and check it. Make sure you're looking at the right profiles. I've made that mistake before, like getting a wild number, and I was looking at the wrong stream. So just double checking all of your work, all of your measurements, and then making sure that your assessment agrees with the surveyor, and then you can go from there. So what happened in this case, so this is an elevation certificate, it's not a letter of map change, but if you look at B9, what they had for the base flood elevation, it just says 1277. And so no matter what you're looking at, a letter of map change or an elevation certificate, it needs to be measured to at least 1/10 of a foot. So that's what they use. So it should have at least 1 decimal place, and they're using 1277, which they got from the firm. So they looked at the rounded off base flood elevation at the downstream cross section, and then that's the number that they used. So that's incorrect. And you can see the source under that. They checked off firm, and that's not what we use for a detailed study. It should be the flood insurance study. It needs to be calculated to 1/10 of a foot, and we got 1278.2. So they are well below what that number is. And then they put in the lowest floor at 1278.1. Again, we have at least a 1 foot freeboard requirement. So they're 1.1 feet below the base flood elevation. And that can be a costly mistake for the property owner. It's a violation. So yeah, that's why this is problematic. It needs to be calculated. And in this particular case, they did have a flood. They had a flood insurance policy claim on the ICC. So that gave them $30,000 to elevate it, and they didn't elevate high enough. So that is the predicament that could happen, if you don't check the base flood elevation. And like I said, we've been seeing quite a few low floor violations, so it's definitely something to be aware of. Okay, so if we're talking about a zone A that doesn't have a detailed study, it's not going to have a flood insurance profile, a flood insurance study. We do have the Kansas BFE portal. So this is a site that you can go to and request that a base flood elevation be calculated by our office, and then we send you that information, or the developer, whoever's requested it, and then that's one option for getting the base flood elevation in a zone A. If it's a detailed study area, it says to consult the FIS, which, as I explained, is the way that it should be done for those areas. And so you just go in, you're going to draw a polygon, hopefully as accurately and carefully as you can, and then you send the request. And then someone in our office actually calculates that. It's not an automated thing. And so when you go in, you can see where all this data is available. And so I think so by the end of June, we should have base level engineering for the entire state. And I do have a little bit of slides on that project, but basically we have these LiDAR elevations and then it's calculated based on that. You can also go into the map and look at a site and just kind of click around and see the approximate LiDAR value. So that's what that 1332 is in the top left corner. This is a good resource for people to go in and just kind of click around and look and see if it's worth their time and their money to try to get a survey done and apply for a LOMA, just to see if they might be a good candidate, because if it's well below what the base flood elevation is for that area, if you can see it, then it wouldn't, And so we give this out to property owners and floodplain administrators pretty often as a handy tool for that. And of course, you can submit requests for the A zone. And so again, the clicking around on the LiDAR is approximate. It's plus or minus a foot, but it's just there to give you an idea of what the approximate elevation there is. Okay, and so this is the flyer that we have, the instructions on how to draw the boundary and then submit the request. And then it says, thank you, DWR will be in touch. And we have a 5-day turnaround time on getting these done. And then you get the letter that gives you the base flood elevation, the lowest adjacent grade. It gives you the map and panel number and all of that. So again, a LOMA will help you get out of the mandatory purchase requirement. It doesn't help with flood insurance premium rates anymore. So we used to have the preferred risk policy, which you could get if you were outside of the special flood hazard area, if you had a LOMA. That doesn't apply anymore. People are usually just using it to get out of the mandatory purchase requirement or permitting stuff. So I do have a little bit more information about permitting and when it applies, especially for the LOMR-F, because there's been some issues with that. But this slide is just kind of a close-up on that language that's in there. So this is a really handy tool. So I'd highly recommend using it if you need a base flood elevation for a zone A. And so since I brought up insurance, I just want to touch on it a little bit. So we're under risk rating 2.0, which is the new rating system. So it used to be your lowest floor elevation versus the base flood elevation would just give you the premium. And so we had rating tables that would do that. We don't have that anymore. Under risk rating 2.0, they're using all of these different data sources to come up with that number. And so it's the risk rating engine. It can determine what your first floor elevation is, so you don't need an elevation certificate anymore either. They're optional, and they'll use that number if it's going to improve your premium. Otherwise, they just use the CoreLogic tool for that. And then the the other stuff that goes into that, your replacement cost value, the catastrophe modeling, FEMA map data. So the firms are still used in some capacity for that. It's just not solely based on the base flood elevation anymore. Cost to rebuild, other data sets from the US Army Corps of Engineers and USGS and so on and so forth. Also including your NFIP policy and claims history. And so this is their attempt to make it more equitable. So yeah, there are other discounts that you can get. So not the LOMA anymore, or the preferred risk policy, but there is a discount for having your machinery and equipment elevated, having proper flood venting and other characteristics. So they would be working with their insurance agents on determining if they qualify for any of those discounts, but that's how it works at this point. And then we have the 2018 LiDAR that's on DASC, which is the Data Access and Support Center. They now have an ArcGIS online portal hub. So there's lots of like publicly available GIS data through that site. So that's helpful. And again, we're going to have the BLE for the entire state this year. And so if you have questions about any of that kind of stuff, I would direct you to our mapping team. And so this is a slide that I stole from one of Tara's presentations, just kind of going over what the BLE is. And so we're looking at the watersheds and using this modeling to create this map information, which is helpful for communities that don't have maps yet. So hopefully down the line, they'll be able to adopt the base level engineering to do regulations, which might help us with NFIP participation. And also, as I said, calculating base flood elevations anywhere in the state, just a little bit more. So it's our CTP grant, which is cooperating technical partner. But yeah, so just accomplish the task of bringing the Zone A level floodplains across the state. So that is awesome. And then the floodplain mapping viewer. So this is our statewide digital floodplain viewer that anyone can access. And we have all of the digital maps on there. We do have the paper maps digitalized as well as a layer here. I'm not sure if there might be some issues with the accuracy of those. Tara might be able to correct me or something if I misspeak on that, but that is available as a layer. So that's helpful. I've been using it quite a bit. If you are still working with paper maps, you can see all the counties outlined in green here that do have digital maps. If you go to our site and our mapping projects, the draft and preliminary maps that we have out are there as well, but this is a really helpful site. It's faster than the National Flood Hazard Layer. It's just for Kansas. It still has the same availability or the same like tools and everything as the National Flood Hazard Layer. You can measure stuff. We have all the different layers and G911 and all of that. So it is helpful. And for the A zones that are based on LiDAR, we have the cross sections that were used to create the maps available there. And so that may help with any Zone A work. At the very least, you can look and get an idea of what the approximate base flood elevation is for those. Of course, that would still have to be calculated. Again, use the BFE portal or by the surveyor or the engineer. So yeah, this is the A zone. I have that outlined. So this is the approximate A zone, and then it has our disclaimer at the bottom that this is from KDA. And so this is kind of like our version of the fermet. So if you go to the print function over here on the left, it will generate like a fermet for you. So we have the map scale and the legend and all of that. So another helpful tool that we have. And then if you have a site that might be impacted by more than one flooding source, like in between two tributaries, then we have to have both base flood elevations calculated, and then we would use the one that's higher that could impact that site. And so we have had, people try to get around this by just zooming into the site and then doing one base flood elevation. So we've had that happen where the letter of map change, I don't remember what kind it was, but it was rejected because of that, that they used the lower base flood elevation instead of the higher one. So just something to be aware of if that's the case. And then mapping status, we're constantly working on new maps. We have them added every year. We have any number of projects going on at a time. So it basically starts out as a watershed and then gets broken down into county-wide DFIRMs. So we have this. Even this is a little bit outdated. We have made some progress since then. Okay, so aside from all of that, the survey information, the lowest adjacent grade, again, that is where the foundation is touching the ground. And so if it's at or above the base flood elevation, you get a LOMA. And so again, it can also be based on the meets and bounds description. Don't forget the datum. And then again, areas of subsidence, if it's in Cherokee or Reno counties, you might want to look into that. So there is also this concept of intervening higher ground, and this is really just for LOMAs. It doesn't really work for LOMR-Fs. Even if they look exactly the same, FEMA looks at it differently if it's on natural grade. And so basically, if you have a pre-firm structure with a basement, like a real and true basement that is below grade on all four sides, the lowest adjacent grade is at the bottom of the window well. So that has to be recorded as the lowest adjacent grade. But if you have this potential intervening higher grade around that, they might consider that as protection enough from the base flood. And so, yeah, FEMA wants to know all of that. It's the same as this non-residential structure at the bottom. So the bottom of that ramp would be the lowest adjacent grade there. And so if it's on natural grade, there could be a potential that it would qualify for a LOMA, even if the lowest adjacent grade is technically below the base flood elevation. So some real life examples of that, even though the window well on the left is covered by plexiglass, the lowest adjacent grade is still at the bottom of that. It doesn't change anything. And so here is a sketch that a surveyor did to try to illustrate this, and it has all the information about the structure, the basement, the lowest adjacent grade at the bottom of the window well, and then the intervening higher grade that should protect the structure from the base flood elevation. And this LOMA was approved. And so having something like this that kind of details how the intervening higher grade would impact the structure and again, protect it from the base flood elevation, that may help in support of the LOMA. Again, this is probably not going to work for a LOMR-F, and if it's a new structure, it definitely should not have a basement. That's not allowed, and I will get into that a little bit more on the second half. But yeah, and then they have this checklist at the end to just kind of go over what all is needed, and so that you make sure you submit all of these documents with the application, again, through the online submission portal. So you need the effective firm panel, and that's where making a fermet comes in, and I will go over that part next. So it's just a kind of close up of the flood map of your area of interest, and then you have a copy of the subdivision plat map with the recorder's office stamp on it, a copy of the deed, and a tax assessor's map. Make sure all of your maps have the north arrows on them and the map scale. So having all of those attachments in there, this little checklist is helpful for that. And yep, other than that, it's pretty straightforward. The MTEZ, very simple form. And so that's why I've saved the MT1 for the LOMR-F. And so making a fermet, again, we kind of talked about these when we were calculating the base flood elevation, or really any project. Being able to have this concise information zoomed in on your area of interest is very useful. So the Map Service Center, this is the Map Service Center for MET, so you can see the black and white aerial imagery background. It'll be similar with a paper map. Of course, you wouldn't have the photograph in the background, but it's the same process there. You can do it through the National Flood Hazard Layer and the floodplain effective viewer for the state that I showed you, and how to do that for MET. So it's all really the same thing, just depending on which resource you like. And so again, if you have paper maps, it would just be the Map Service Center. I guess with our layer on the effective map viewer, you could create a fermet that way as well, but you would probably want to stick with the Map Service Center for that. And so if you type in FEMA MSC, it should pull it up. But this is what it looks like. So you have your area of interest, you have your map scale, your north arrow, and then your title block that gives all of that information about the community number, and the full map and panel number, the effective date, all of the map information that you would need for the letter of map change applications or the elevation certificate or floodplain development permits. And so again, this is the Map Service Center. So you would be able to search all products is what you need to do for the paper maps. If you have digital maps, you can type in the address and it will pull it up as far as the National Flood Hazard Layer. That's what it's going to use for that. So I go to search all products most of the time to look at all the data for a community, because you have the effective data. So this is where you would find the flood insurance study, all the effective map panels. If you have preliminary map panels, that will be in there. So it's a useful resource. So it's a little bit quicker if you're just looking for an address. Again, for an area that has a digital map, you can just type it in there. Otherwise, you go to search all products and then choose Kansas, and then the county, and then what community within that county, including the unincorporated areas. You're working in an unincorporated area. So this is what happens when I type in our address at the Topeka field office. It pulls it right up. And so you can see our office building right there, City of Topeka. It gives the full map and panel number right there. On this screenshot, the effective date for the map, it shows you the corporate boundaries, and then the floodplain. So you can see our building is not in the floodplain, but we are adjacent to it. So you have this great view of the floodway, the AE zone, the 500-year, and all of our cross sections and all of that. So this is what the National Flood Hazard Layer looks like. It's a little bit different in coloration, but it's the same data. It's colored to help those with color blindness, which we are also trying to incorporate in our mapping, as we've had some issues with that. But if it doesn't pull up the right address, you might add in the zip code. That might help narrow it down, pinpoint that location. And so yeah, if you click on dynamic map there in the center of the screen, it will generate your fermet for you. And so this is what it looks like for our building. So you have a very close view of the floodplain here. It's very clearly labeled. And then you have a very detailed legend here. So you can see the floodway in red and blue and all of the different zones there. And then of course the aerial photo background, the map scale at the bottom. You have a representative fraction and a map scale, so you can measure it. Again, you want to preserve the map scale if you're going to print it out. And then all of the other map information that you would need, again, map and panel number and all of that. And it even tells you when I made this map and has a disclaimer and the resource of how I did it and all of that. So very useful. If you like this style of format, that's fine. Again, search all products. This is what it looks like. You pick the state, the county, and the community. So for this one, I picked Topeka, then you would hit search, and then it brings you here. So towards the top, you can see effective products. And then I've gone to firm panels. So these are all the effective firm panels for Topeka. I think I may have switched to Lawrence, but all the effective firm panels for that community are here and the effective date. And so once you know what panel you're looking for, you can hit view and look at that panel and then create a ferment from there. And so you can see there's 158 effective products. And then those are broken down into firm panels and FIS and digital data and stuff like that. So again, if you need the FIS, this is where you would go to find that. And so if you're working with paper maps and you don't know what panel you need, the first effective product here under firm panels is index. So you can see IND in that panel number. And so that is for index. So you would open that and then be able to see kind of just a map of all the panels. So this is the old Lawrence map, index map. So again, if you're working with paper maps, you can use these larger landmarks to find where your site is to at least figure out what panel you need. And so if you're close to the airport or the highway, or you're along a certain creek or tributary, it should be easier to narrow down based on these larger landmarks. And then you can go back to your effective list, find the panel, and then open that. And then it will open you up to the full panel. So this one is back to Topeka. So this is a digital map. Again, it's going to be different if you're looking at paper maps, but it's the same concept here that you would find your area of interest and then make the ferment. So all you need to do is hit create a ferment, and then it will ask you what page size you want to use. Again, that's going to be important if you're going to print it out. You're going to be printing it in its actual size so you don't cause any distortion. So just be aware of that. Otherwise, I just go with the default 8x11, normal size piece of paper, and then you'd hit next, select print area, and then you would drag the green box that's over the notes to users. You drag that to your area of interest, you hit next, and then the boxes over the scale and north arrow will light up. You adjust those how you want them. The same for the title block, and then it'll show you a preview of what you've made. And so if you're happy with that, then you can just download it as a PDF or PNG file. PDF is pretty standard to work with. That's what we use here at the state. And so you'd click download, save it, file it away geographically. Again, it's good to just have these with any projects that you're working on, whether it's a permitting issue or a letter of map change, just having these to be able to refer back to in your permit files and all of that. So it's easier if you want to come back to this and take a look at it. And then you just conveniently have all this information available to you. And then again, you just save it. Yep, PDF. Okay, yeah, and then that's what it looks like. So again, the National Flood Hazard Layer is a little bit different, but it's the same data if it's digital. And so in this example, you have the floodway again, diagonal crosshatching, and then you have the black and orange crosshatching as well, which is an area that is protected by a certified levee. So that is considered to be out of the special flood hazard layer, but this is the color scheme that they're using now. So that's basically using the flood maps and getting the flood maps and the flood insurance study. Another thing to just touch on is the LOMA out as shown. So this is something that can be done by a property owner themselves. They don't have to get a survey, and this is for a case where usually the lender and their third-party determination company, especially when people get new maps, is that they have floodplain on their property, and then the lender is telling them that they have to buy a flood insurance policy because they're in the floodplain, even though when we get close to the map, the actual structure is not in the floodplain. So this is pretty common. So in this example, this duplex, so 3414 and 3412 may be considered to be in the floodplain based on the third third-party determination companies that lenders will use. And so we can't really make determinations for banks. They are responsible for doing that themselves, and we could get in a lot of trouble if we make a mistake. So that's why they have these companies that they're using. And so they're just running a computer program that tells them that the floodplain intersects with the legal description of that property. And so based on that, they consider it to be in. And so that's why they're under the mandatory purchase requirement. So if the lender is saying they have the mandatory purchase requirement, then they can't get out of that unless they have a LOMA, even though the structure is shown to be clearly outside of the floodplain. So that's why we have the out as shown process. It's very easy. FEMA has updated these instructions, and it's really straightforward to be able to do it. You just have the deed, a ferment, and then you fill out the MTEZ in a certain way. Like you're going to put OAS on certain parts of it, that application. And so again, it's pretty straightforward. Property owners can do it themselves. And so yeah, the instructions are there. So I send these instructions out quite often to people who call me with this issue, and it has, helped them resolve it pretty quickly. So again, that just helps with the mandatory purchase requirement stuff. So yeah, if you want a copy of that, let me know. I'm happy to send it to you. Then you'd have the same attachments pretty much. A ferment, a copy of the deed, an aerial photo map, usually from like the GIS department of that community is fine. And then you would just submit that. Yeah, if you already have an elevation certificate, they can have a surveyor just submit the LOMA request for them using that instead of the elevation information on the actual application. Again, that would just be for a structure, not a meets and bounds description, because again, the EC is just for structures. So that is just something else to be aware of if they could skip paying for another survey. And then definitely using the online submission portal. Hopefully no one else is still holding out on the postal mail stuff. Again, that just really slows down the whole thing, and it's more expensive. There's like $100 charge for them to review and scan in hard documents. So definitely want to go with the online submission. And again, LOMAs don't protect people from getting flooded. Anything larger than the base flood will inundate that structure if it's very close to the floodplain. And so, there's no force field outside of the special flood hazard area. Larger floods do happen. And so people get LOMAs approved and then they drop their insurance. And then if they get flooded, there's really no recourse for them. So I'm still encouraging people to get flood insurance. It can be expensive, but it is important to recovery. And so, yeah, I have, more classes on, post-flood responsibility coming up and other things that relate to that, but there are these resources. So we're nearing the end of the first half here, but yeah, I think I have this slide later on in the presentation as well. And so with that, we will launch the first poll question. So again, please participate if you plan on asking for a certificate. I need you to participate in these 2 questions that we're going to ask. And then we'll take a short break. So true or false, a LOMA can help with flood insurance premiums. Okay, so we'll give it like another 15 seconds for you to submit that. Again, please participate if you want credit. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. So again, LOMAs used to be able to help with flood insurance premiums via the preferred risk policy, but they don't help with premiums anymore. So that is false. They just get you out of the mandatory purchase requirement under risk rating 2.0. And so some people got it wrong, 63%. That's okay though. Asking this question might help you remember, LOMAs don't help with flood insurance premiums anymore, not under risk rating 2.0. So, okay. With that, it is 10 o'clock. Let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 10:05 and we will wrap up the second half talking about the LOMR-F.
Great, thanks, Cheyenne. And I think I answered most of the questions in the chat, but if anybody has any clarifying or wants any questions clarified, please let me know.
I see there's been a lot of conversation going
Yes,
on.
yeah. So I've been trying to keep up. So, but let me know if I didn't answer something all the way. So thanks.
Thanks. Okay, it's 10:05, so we're at the end of the break. We thought we would just go ahead and relaunch the first question in case anyone missed it. That way you can still request credit at the end as long as you do both questions. So if you miss the question the first time, go ahead and answer it now, and that way we can get that recorded if you
Yeah,
want to.
and if you already took it, don't worry about redoing it. I did save the results from that, so you'll still get credit if you did answer it already. So
Give you like 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end it, which is great. Yes, that is false now, so awesome. Okay, let's okay. Okay, so part two, again, the LOMR-F, as we covered the LOMA. So the LOMR-F is, obviously for fill. It's a letter of map revision based on fill. And so these are usually smaller projects like commercial or subdivision or even a single house, depending on where it's located, will be elevated on fill. So you can build a fill pad, take out the entire pad and then build on it. Or have a LOMR-F, which will, determine if you build the way you're proposing to do so, will it be inundated by the base flood elevation? And so again, this is the MT1 application, and this is the little caveat that I had mentioned earlier, that the timing defines whether it's fill as per the Code of Federal Regulations. And so if it was placed before the area was mapped into the floodplain, it can be considered natural grade. And so this is in the CFR Part 70. And then it's considered natural grade, so you could do a LOMA instead of a LOMR-F. And so that would have to be supported by some kind of data or historical photography, something like that, that shows that it was there before the map. And so if that can be done, that might be helpful to an applicant. The LOMR-F does have a fee associated with it, and potential intervening higher grade might count more. And so the FEMA reviewers would determine if it qualifies to be considered natural grade. So just something to be aware of. Again, the MT1 for the LOMR-F. So again, this would be required for a LOMA that is a commercial property or for multiple properties, or if it's in the floodway, then we need to use this form. Again, that's why some people just use this form for all the LOMAs. So the list of letters here, LOMA, the CLOMA and the CLOMR-F are the conditional letters. So if you file a conditional letter, you still have to go through with the final LOMA or LOMR-F. It's not an automatic process. Those are filed separately. And of course, if you have done that, then it has to be built the way it was, described in the conditional letter. So yes, a lot of people just skip the CLOMR-F. It's not usually required, so it's just kind of optional. And then if you do that, you get a bit of a discount on the final LOMR-F. But yeah, again, there's a fee associated with that. And so for these in particular, we would want to make sure that everything is correct, because we don't want to waste time and money and other resources on something that's going to be denied. And so this is a lot more where the violations come into place, and what we've seen with like basements and stuff like that. And so we'll go through this. And so this form is in 4 parts. And so the first part, again, whatever letter you're applying for, and then it goes into information about the fill. So again, all of this stuff is on the MT1, as is the MTEZ. Again, we want to check the website in case there have been any updates, and then the paperwork burden disclosure notices in all of their forms. So yeah, it looks pretty similar to the MTEZ. So to definitely be aware of what not to use this form for, definitely fill placed in the floodway is a big one. That's definitely a violation. That needs to have, at the very least, a no rise. It may require a LOMR. And so I did see a little bit in the chat about changing streams, even stream restoration, that kind of thing is not a LOMR-F or a LOMA. That would be more of a LOMR and CLOMR type of requirement. And so the community officials would be involved and not just the applicant. And that's a whole longer process. It's a different application. It's the MT2 application. And so if you do have any interest in learning more about that process, we do have how to file a LOMR Part 1 and 2 class recorded on our training page. That was with one of our engineers that goes through that whole process. So just to be aware, definitely no fill in the floodway. We're dealing with a case right now where they put fill in the floodway and then filed for a LOMR-F. And so now we're dealing with that issue. They did an after the fact no-rise certificate. So definitely being aware of that. No changes in the regulatory floodway boundaries or delineations. Again, stream restoration and any regulated stream is going to also have state permitting and maybe U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permitting. And so that's a whole other thing. So just be aware of that. And we don't really have alluvial fans in Kansas. There might be some on the very western edge. Other than that, we don't have V zones because that's coastal areas. And so, yeah, mostly what we're dealing with is fill in the floodway type of issues or anything to deal with the floodway. So really, anything floodway related would probably be a LOMA. So just putting that out there. Anyways, property information. So again, whatever letter you're applying for. And then the next question, has fill been placed on the property and when? So you will have that month and year that it was placed. Again, with the timing and whether it could be considered natural grade. So in this case, in this picture, you can see the fill has been placed there very recently. The ground is all disturbed. There's tire tracks through it. And so this one is definitely more recent. And then will fill be placed on that property? And so that question is in place for the CLOMR-F, which is the conditional letter. And so yes, when will it be placed, the month and year, and then if you have checked yes, you have to supply them with the documentation that you verified the Endangered Species Act. And so I have quite a few slides going over this, as FEMA has really emphasized the Endangered Species Act after they were sued by multiple entities for not enforcing the Endangered Species Act. They have now made communities responsible for that. So that's why they've been emphasizing it a lot more. So we'll go through that. Otherwise, the street address, which is similar to what we talked about before, the legal description from the deed. And then checking off after that, what we're requesting be taken out of the floodplain. Is it for a structure? When were they built? Again, we're going to be looking at that date, and FEMA may flag potential violations if it's not a pre-firm structure or a portion of the land. So the meets and bounds description or the entire legally recorded property. So that's going to be more common on the LOMR-F because we're putting in a fill pad. Often we'll build that and then want to take the entire just top of the fill pad out, and that way they can build whatever they like on it. However, in the community acknowledgement form, it says that whatever structures are going to go on the LOMR-F are going to comply with your adopted regulations. So that includes your higher standards, whatever freeboard you have adopted, and definitely no basements. And so there has been this loophole where people will build a fill pad, get a LOMR-F for the entire pad, and then once they have that approved, they will dig down into the fill pad and put in basements, and that is an issue that FEMA has been trying to deal with. So yeah, we've been getting some cases like that where people have done this, and it's been a loophole for a long time that they've been trying to correct. And mostly they're looking for violations at FEMA minimums, and then once we get that, we at the state are also concerned with higher standards. That's what it says. That's what you sign off on the community acknowledgement form. And so it's definitely a concern, as we're gonna have to follow through and make sure you do enforcement on that. And then if you're in the CRS program, there are concerns with staying in compliance with the NFIP and stuff. So just making sure that these applications actually do conform with the ordinance is really important. So, and then the last question on this section, is it for a single structure, a single lot, multiple structures, or multiple lots, and then how many? So that information would be filled out. So again, it is somewhat similar to the LOMA. Again, we're just talking about fills and fill pads. And so back to the Endangered Species Act compliance. So typically we're talking about areas of floodplain that might have habitat or the rare and endangered species living in that. So we're talking about mostly undeveloped areas. And so if you do have that, then there's the incidental take permit that's required when you're going to be taking that habitat. If it's impacted by a non-federal activity, federal agencies have their own processes that they have to follow for that. So you can identify where these species are. We have a couple of resources that I'll show you. So they have been promising new ESA guidance for quite a while, but they're still in litigation. As far as I know, I know at least one of those cases was settled, but there are probably others, and litigation takes a long time. So eventually we might have more guidance on this. There have been some developments on doing reviews and floodplain stuff, so I'll show you that. But one of the resources is the Kansas Wildlife and Parks. You can get a list of species by counties to be aware of. And then the fresh mapping tool that I'll show you is, mapping wetlands and the habitat and what kind of species you might run into. So if you need a determination on the ESA, it's simple enough to get a determination from the Manhattan U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services field office. You just send them a description and a map, and they may ask for additional documentation, but once you have that determination from them, you can save that correspondence as documentation that you did this. And then there's the IPAC site, which is the Information for Planning and Consulting, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And so this is new. FEMA has entered some agreements with them on evaluating certain types of projects so that you can get concurrence that they wouldn't need further consultation. So I have a little bit more information on that, but I know this is not officially accepted by FEMA. There's a few caveats to that I'll get to, but this is basically the long and short of it. Of course, I'll be sending out any updates that we get on FEMA guidance as far as the ESA, because that's really important. You don't want to accidentally violate that. So definitely be very familiar with the project if you're signing off on a community acknowledgement form for a LOMR-F, which you should have to sign off on all of them. So if someone is filing a LOMR-F, it's a requirement that the community signs off on it. So, if they try to go through without your signature, there's definitely an issue there. But this is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Manhattan Field Office information. So that's the email address that you would contact them at to get the determination, the phone number there. Okay, whoops, sorry. Okay, so sorry. So the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks, this is the county list of species. So this is a useful resource that you can just quickly look at and get an idea of some of the things that might be an issue. So this is the Kansas field office for them. And they can help with an official determination. Otherwise, we do have, again, the IPAC, Information for Planning and Consultation. So there have been some updates to this site. It used to say coming soon on the build a consultation package. So they have really changed this. So you have explore species and habitat, conduct a regulatory review, and then again, the consultation package. So any of these functions can be used independently or together or in any combination. The point is to save time on getting through this review process. And so they estimate they have saved about 14 years for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's staff time, and then about 898 years for users since 2018 in time reduced waiting for postal mail or for the reviewers to get to their project. So you can get a response within a couple of hours. You can sometimes get all of the input needed to move forward with your project by doing this. And so they do have new training and videos that they've put out just in the last year on this page. So if you are interested in this, if you have any projects that you would need ESA compliance on, this may be able to save some time. As I mentioned, FEMA has negotiated some agreements to expedite the review process for some routine activities that have minimal impact on the listed species and their habitats. So FEMA can approve certain types of projects without the extensive U.S. Fish and Wildlife consultation that it would have normally taken if you provide them with a good scope of work to determine if the project is going to qualify under those agreements. So this is the outcome letter that will be generated if you go through the process on their website and make an account and all of that. And so you go through the type of work that you're going to be doing. You can drag and drop a shapefile into their mapping tool and get the regulatory review part done, define the project, and then they have the step-by-step consultation process in there. So that's part of the consultation package function that they have in there. So it's an interactive process for the full package that leverages the U.S. Fish and Wildlife data and recommendations. So you put this together, it's going to help speed up the review. And so they go through what kind of impacts you might have. You can request the official species list and what is applicable as far as rules for your project by species. And so basically you get this outcome letter and then you submit that to the federal action agency, which in our case would be FEMA. And then they determine if they can concur with the services. So again, this is something that you're submitting yourself to FEMA based on the outcome letter, and then they'll decide if they concur with that or not. It's not submitted by the service themselves. So they used to be, we weren't sure if this would be approved or not via this service, but they have changed and made updates to it. And again, FEMA has entered into those agreements to help streamline the process using these tools. So that is something that's a little bit newer. Again, you can go to that site and look at their videos and the training that they have there. Another tool is the Fresh Map, so flood risk and endangered species habitat. It's just another planning tool that you have to visualize those species and habitats and look at those special flood hazard area overlay. So that's the link to the mapping tool. There is a new CRS activity for this. So if you're in that program, there is credit to make a floodplain species assessment and plan. So the plan identifies what can be done to protect and conserve that species selected for attention as far as what is in your community. And then it kind of goes over what the species is and that information, and then identifies recovery actions and provides a plan of action for implementing that and recovery measures. So if you're interested in that, there's a whole guide on these, on that activity. And so just a little side note on the ESA there, I just wanted to give you that information. We are pushing it more. FEMA's pushing it more, and we do, ask about that when we audit communities and things like that. So just putting that out there. If you ever need a determination, I think just go ahead and ask the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Manhattan Field Office, just to be on the safe side. Again, you don't want to accidentally violate the ESA. So the next section, the checklist, again, it's very similar to the other checklist. It's basically the same thing. You have your ferment, the subdivision or plat map from the recorder's office, the copy of the deed, and then in this case, you have the separate elevation form. Excuse me. Either that, or you could use the elevation certificate if that is for a structure, and then making sure you have the map scale and north arrow on those. And then a little bit more on this checklist for Form 3, the community acknowledgement form, making sure that they have that and that it's been signed by the community official. And then for LOMR-Fs, it goes again into having the documented ESA compliance. So, there's a little bit more on this checklist depending on what you're applying for. Again, it's a lot cheaper and faster to submit these online, and they ask that you do that because it will add another like $100 on top of the fee for hard copies. And then there's a payment form on this one, the processing fee. So check the fee that applies to your request. So the single ladder structure for a LOMR-F that follows the LOMR-F is $325. So you get like $100 discount on that if you actually filed for a LOMR-F. The LOMR-F is $500. Single lot or structure for the LOMR-F, $425, $700 for multiple lots and structures, or $800 for the multiple lot or structure LOMR-F or LOMR-F. Again, a little bit of a discount, so it looks like $100 discount across the board if you filed the conditional letter. So just being aware of what these costs, again, that's kind of why it's really important that the LOMR-F is going to be approved, because there is this cost associated with it. Again, the LOMA does not have a cost. It looks like the CLOMA does, but not the actual LOMA itself, which is likely why the CLOMA and the LOMR-F get skipped pretty often. So yeah, there are certain cases where they might be required. So just being aware of, what type of project you're doing. Of course, if you have questions, let us know about any project. And then the email address, definitely check that and provide that so that you can save time. So something strange about technical bulletin 10 is that if you go through this, if you build as it says in this technical bulletin, your LOMR-F will be denied. So this technical bulletin has always been a little bit confusing for me why they have written it this way. You have a basement that is well below the BFE. And so really the point here is that the LOMR-F should not have a basement. Again, this is a total loophole that has been causing issues with, the FEMA reviewers flagging violations, and then we have to do all the enforcement stuff on it. But you can really only put in basements if you have the residential basement exemption, and we only have 10 communities that have that, and they have, for the most part, stopped using it because it has caused quite a few issues. And so, again, the community acknowledgement form says that it's going to comply with your ordinance, so that means you can't put in any basements. And so people ask me that quite often, and no, it's definitely against the rules. unless you're doing residential basement floodproofing and you're part of that program. So just being aware of that, definitely if someone is coming to you with an application for a basement, don't sign off on the community acknowledgement form because then you're kind of liable for that violation, which could cause even more issues later on. So just being aware of that. Again, if you're not sure, let us know. We're happy to help. And as I mentioned, what's acceptable for a LOMA may not work for the LOMR-F, most likely not going to consider the potential intervening higher ground, even if the two structures look exactly the same, but one's on fill, it doesn't count the same way. And so again, the lowest adjacent grade is at the bottom of the ramp at this in this example. So if it's below the BFE, you're most likely going to get a denial. So definitely have to have everything at or above the BFE to be able to get the LOMR-F approved. And again, we have been having issues with this where it may comply with FEMA minimum standards, and so they approve the LOMR-F, but they are telling us that it still has to conform with the ordinance. So you know, there's just been some complicated issues around that. So just being aware of that, make sure that plans are compliant. And so again, it's a little bit different because the LOMA is a correction to the map. Whereas if you're bringing in fill to elevate things above the floodplain, you're changing the map, which is why the whole fee charge is justified. We're not correcting the map, we're changing the map. And so, yeah, as long as we're making sure it's reasonably safe from flooding, which means putting the lowest adjacent grade at or above the BFE, then it's reasonably safe. Putting in a basement is not reasonably safe. So just trying to make it make sense. So yeah, we have seen quite a few of these issues before. This is the same example. The lowest adjacent grade here is at the bottom of the ramp at the basement floor on the top right side of this walkout basement, and then at the bottom of the window well for an actual basement. So yeah, that's always going to be your lowest adjacent grade. Okay, and yeah, no intervening higher grade for these. So the patio basement might work if it was for a LOMA, but not a LOMR-F. Bottom of the page, more contact information section. And so like another example that we had is where the floor was too low on a property, on a structure. It had a crawl space. And so they put fill around the foundation and then tried to get a LOMR-F, saying that that made it elevated on fill, where the inside of the crawl space was then below grade. So it was at grade before they brought in the fill. They put fill around that, then it was below grade, and that made it into a basement. Technically, by FEMA's definition, that it was below grade on all sides, and then that made it a violation. The FEMA reviewer flagged that, and then they passed it on to us, and so we had to help them fix that. I think they took the fill back out. That was before I was here, but again, just another example of what can happen if it's a non-compliant design. And we could have helped them avoid that if they had come to us first to help them work through it, the applicant, not the community. So yeah, we could have been of more assistance to them and avoided that issue. So again, we don't want to submit LOMR-Fs that are not going to be approved because they're kind of expensive. And so any waste of time or resources is something to avoid. Okay. And the lowest adjacent grade is going to include any attached deck or garage or stairs, any part of the structure that's touching, the foundation of the structure, any part of that that's touching the ground is going to count. And so it's the same thing for a LOMA. So just something else to be aware of, attached deck or garage would also have to be at or above the BFE. It's the same thing on the elevation certificate. It's under C2H that's part of this. So something else that would count for a LOMA or a LOMR-F. So this is the elevation form. Again, NFIP community number. So we went over where to find that. The property address there, existing or proposed conditions. So proposed would be for the conditional letters. And then definitely the type of foundation we have, basement, enclosure, crawl space, all of that. Part of where they're going to find potential violations. So being aware of that, definitely reviewing the full application before you sign off on the third form, which is the community acknowledgement form. Land subsidence or uplift, again, Cherokee or Reno counties could be an issue there. The elevation datum, that needs to be checked and consistent, or it could be converted using the NGS conversion software. Just want to make sure that's accurate. Again, going back and looking at the base flood elevation that they've determined, how they determined it, and if you agree with that. Because again, it's a lot more important that you're signing off on the community acknowledgement form. It's a lot different from a LOMA as far as, you know, your concurrence on whether it's compliant, and because you're a little bit on the line after you sign it. And then there have been cases where you sign off on the acknowledgement form and then they go and change the plan and build something else. So that's kind of going back to doing inspections, and anything can happen, and issues like that have always, or typically always, been on the part of the applicant doing things unscrupulously. It's not usually communities, but you know, making sure that they're actually following through with what you've signed off on, something else to ensure. So it can be quite a bit of work, but probably worth it to avoid any future issues as far as liability. Okay, and then again, datums, always making sure the datums are checked off and correct. So this is the community status book. As I said, this is another resource where you can find information as far as the community number, and it does have the current effective date, and a little bit more about the initial firm date and if you're in the CRS program. So if you just want to check this quickly, you can just type in community status book for Kansas and it'll pull it up. I use it pretty often to just get a quick look at things. Existing or proposed, again, LOMA or LOMR-F. Yep. So this is the new version of the conversion software. So it used to be VertCon, now it's called NCAT. And then this is a graph that just kind of shows what the difference is between datums across the country. So we're in the middle, we're just kind of in that middle range, but especially as you go west, it's a big deal if you mix up the datums. And like in the LOMA and the elevation certificate with the base flood elevation that we calculated, if they had made a mistake there with the datums, they could be off by even more than 1.1 feet. It could have been a lot worse. And so in Western Kansas, this can be around 20 inches off. So it's a pretty big deal if there's a mistake made with the datums and mixing them up. As I said, FEMA has pointed it out to us that they have been converted incorrectly, or they should have been converted and weren't. So making sure that's accurate if you have to sign off on one of these. But it's pretty easy for the surveyor to go in to the software and just use the transformation tool. It's pretty straightforward. And then the elevation form. Again, this could be an elevation certificate instead of this, but it does you know, ask for the address, the lot number, that information. Again, lowest lot elevation is going to be important if we're talking about the entire legally recorded property, or the top of the fill pad, the lowest adjacent grade to the structure, base flood elevation, BFE source. And so again, making sure those are accurate and you know, done correctly. So again, LOMR-F, usually taking out the entire top of a fill pad and then building on it. It's considered to be out of the floodplain. Some communities just go ahead and adopt those into their ordinances. So it says any approved LOMR-F properties also have to comply and are still, subject to getting permits and all of that. Might be a good idea if you have these going on and you don't want potential violations going on. Like, as I said, you might sign off on something and then they build something else, or they just try to go in and dig into the basement or dig into the fill pad to put in a basement. That could invalidate their LOMR-F as well. So that's not allowed. It's a loophole, the whole thing I just went over. But so yeah, just trying to drive that home because we have been seeing a lot of those cases. And then the meets and bounds description here at the bottom, lowest adjacent grade, all of that. So just some notes in here, again, following the instructions that are provided separate to the application, but it goes through each section and what's required. So the elevation form, second page, if you're doing multiple properties. So this is a property in Derby. Excuse me, it's a compliant fill pad. So they put in fill, there's a retaining wall, and then they put a manufactured home on top of that. And so if they're trying to get a LOMR-F, again, that staircase, it looks like it's a little bit lower, and then the lowest adjacent grade where it's touching the staircase would have to be included, and make sure that that is at or above the base flood elevation. Okay, and then the community form. So really, one of the most important parts of this whole process is the community official, the floodplain administrator, signing off on this form. And so we've been seeing some people just kind of signing anything and not looking through the whole project, and signing off on things that aren't compliant, signing off on putting fill in the floodway. That's not good. So the community number, name or address, so this part. But yeah, read through all the instructions before you sign off on this. Go through the entire project before signing off on it. So this is what it says for the LOMR-F, requests involving the placement of fill that you have gone through and are making sure that is compliant with everything it lists in this paper, in this paragraph. It's not putting fill in the floodway. It says that making sure that federal and state permits have been applied for and approved. The Endangered Species Act for the conditional letter. And it's required for the conditional letter because it's before construction. If it's a LOMR-F, they just kind of consider that the damage has already been done, so they're not asking for that. Just as a side note, but it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a violation on that. So that's why it's requested for the conditional letter, but then also reasonably safe from flooding as defined in the CFR. And so again, that is why it says the proposed project meets or is designed to meet all of the community floodplain management requirements, including all of that. So that's why we're saying that it has to comply with your ordinance, including your higher standards. Again, FEMA is looking out for the FEMA minimum violations, but basically it's saying it has to meet all of the adopted standards. So that's why there's no basements. And yeah, so again, we've had cases where people go rogue after this has been signed, and then they put in a basement. And so we had a case like that, and they were trying to dispute it, and the floodplain administrator was saying that this is the plan that they signed off on, that's not what they built, and they were trying to say that the community acknowledgement form is not legally binding. And then so if something like that happens again, don't sign the form at all, just don't sign it. You never have to sign this form if you don't agree with it. So What could be more legally binding and protect you a little bit better is doing a covenant on the deed for no basements. That might hold up a little bit better in the case that it went to court or something like that. Yeah, we've seen like notice on the deed for violations, something like that, more in the realm of land use and zoning regulations as far as like state law. That might work a little bit better, and I would, highly recommend doing a covenant on the deed to, have that backup that you have signed off on a plan that says no basements.
Hey Cheyenne, sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. We had a
Mhm.
question. Can you go back to the last picture? There was a question on where the lag would be with the retaining wall. And it was asking if wouldn't the lag be at the bottom of the retaining wall?
No, no, because sorry, the structure's sitting on top of the fill, and so wherever the lowest adjacent grade is actually touching on the top of this fill pad, and that's why I said it kind of looks like the staircase is a little bit lower. That's where the lowest adjacent grade would be, wherever the structure is touching the top of this fill pad, and this is what's been removed from the floodplain, not the bottom. So this would be in the floodplain and the bottom of the fill pad, whereas we take out the top of the fill pad and any structures on top of that. So I hope does that make sense?
Hopefully that answered your question, Melissa, but if not, feel free to type in the chat.
Yeah, we'll be wrapping up soon here, and we can discuss things a little bit more. Again, so no fill in the floodway. Definitely don't sign off on something like that. Again, that would be the MT2 form and a LOMR-F. It could require a CLOMR-F, definitely state permits and maybe USACE permits. So again, don't waste time or money on something that's not going to be approved. State DWR permits, so they're a little bit different from the NFIP rules, and usually it does have to deal with putting fill in the floodplain. On average, if it's a foot or more, fill is going to trigger that requirement. And so, again, you are signing off on having made sure that federal and state permits were approved and applied for and all of that. And so, we have had another case where a LOMR-F was approved and the floodplain administrator had no idea about it. And they're like, how did you get this approved without me signing the community acknowledgement form? Someone else had signed it somehow. So that's something that could happen, people just completely circumventing you. Sorry, I just skipped through the slides again. Okay, yeah, and then as I said, keeping any correspondence with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife as compliance. They may ask to see it. And then making sure probably the fill pad is going to be at least 1 foot above the BFE, or at the very least the lowest floor, reasonably safe, no basements, all of that. Okay. So yeah, I just threw this slide in here just to try to really emphasize this, because we have been dealing with it quite a bit. Again, statewide, 1 foot of freeboard, meets your higher standards, state fill permits, and then again, LOMR-F areas can be added to the ordinance, so that they have to comply, and any future developments would also comply. So that is an option, and then they would still be out of the mandatory purchase requirement, which is often a driving force for people to apply for letters of map change. Okay, because again, we have been going back and doing retroactive enforcement. So yeah, reasonably safe. We've been through all of this, but the community form is really important as far as the LOMR-F. Basements are not reasonably safe. And then this is the case that I had talked about before, where they put fill around the outside of a structure. Again, that might cause issues if it was an existing structure. So yeah, this created a whole basement situation. A little bit about insurance again as we wrap things up. So Risk rating 2.0 is looking at the first floor height, which is the building's first lowest floor above the adjacent grade as the rating variable. So the higher that is, the less damage it will incur, the lower the premium is the general idea behind that. It has been that way since before in the legacy rating method. The higher your floor is, the lower your premium is going to be. So just taking a look at how they determine this, it depends on if it's pre or post firm, depending on like what floor they're looking at, if it's the floor of the enclosure or the first elevated floor. So just putting a little insurance information out there. Yeah, and then you would sign off on this part of the community form. So this is part B, and this is for the property located within the regulatory floodway for the LOMA that is not on fill, but it's in the floodway. This is where you would sign off for that, and basically, you're acknowledging that there's been no fill for that structure. And again, you have some form of liability for signing off on stuff. And then again, recognizing where the floodway is via your map. So we have to, take a look at where the property is and, check on what zone it's in. And then the payment form, just filling out, this part for payment and, making sure you have the fee correct for whatever you're applying for. Definitely want to do the online submission for this. And so there wouldn't be a payment form if you're doing a LOMA, even if it's a LOMA in the floodway, there's no payment for that. So it doesn't need to be filled out for those applications. But yeah, again, definitely use the online electronic submission because of the $100 extra charge for the postal mail submittal. So this is what the online submission website looks like. Again, there may be some technical difficulties with that right now. So yeah, people have been reaching out to us and we don't have much help for them. That's going to be on their tech support and stuff. But this is what it looks like and where it should be submitted. And then basically, if anyone, including community officials, provide false information intentionally to the federal government, it's a crime. So don't want to do that. Really doubt anyone here taking training would do something like that. But again, most of the shadiness has been through applicants and property owners, not the communities. But being aware that people might, do something like that. So this is the same slide as before. We're supported by our FEMA regional staff. So we have a little bit there. Left the old state coordinator number, but that is Tara, and I have our contact information at the end. Sorry, I will update that. The FEMA MSC for finding your maps, making formats, stuff like that. The FEMA virtual library. That link may have changed as well, but basically if you're looking for any specific publication, you can just search for it online and find a PDF. Or if you have questions, of course, I'm happy to send you resources for stuff. Yep. Okay. And then there are independent study courses if you're interested on that. There's one for LOMAs and LOMR-Fs, and then you can get a little certificate for that for CECs. And then again, if you have questions, looking in the instructions have been updated in the last couple of years to help people and avoid some common mistakes and frequently asked questions. So definitely take a look at that. If you have questions, it can be really helpful. And especially read through it if you're signing on a community acknowledgement form. Okay. So with that, we have about 5 minutes left to wrap things up and do some questions. But first, our last poll question for the day. Again, please answer this question if you want to ask for credit. For a structure with a LOMR-F, the lowest floor elevation, or LFE, must be what? So we have 2 or above the base flood elevation, below the BFE, at least 1 foot above, or there's no elevation requirement. So I'll give you another 10, 15 seconds. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll here. Last chance to answer the question if you need to answer it. Okay, great. Yes, at least 1 foot above the BFE, because again, any structure for the LOMR-F application has to comply with the ordinance, and we have this statewide 1 foot above BFE requirement. So that would be at the very least what it should have. It might even be higher than that depending on what kind of freeboard you have adopted. Okay. And then here's our contact information if you have questions for us. If you think of something later, feel free to get in contact with us. But yeah, otherwise, if you want a certificate, please let me know. I don't just send them out automatically, so just send me an email request. I'll send out a reminder about that when I send out the post-training survey. Again, if you want credit, you had to have answered both of the poll questions. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording if I can. No, I'm not a co-host, but anyways. Okay.
Oh, yeah, you are a co-host, but I can go ahead and stop it. So you should be able to.